Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome. My name is Louise Huang, and I have the privilege of directing the Center for Research and Science at Azusa Pacific University. Our center hosts regular science and faith events on contemporary, complex topics. This time, we attempt to address what is human, an exposition on Imago Dei. Packed in this title are questions such as, are humans just a collection of genes and cells? What about our purpose? And what does Imago Dei, made in God's image, mean? What about in practice? What are the implications of being human? And has any of these changed in light of technological advancements? So I am delighted that you can join us today for this webinar as we learn and discuss about all these. Before we begin, I would like to point out that you can start to submit questions for our panel discussion later on using the Q&A box. Only questions in the Q&A box will be considered. And now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today. Dr. Praveen Sethupathy is an associate professor of biomedical sciences and director of the Center for Vertebrate Genomics at Cornell University, where he directs a research lab focused on genomic approaches to understand physiology and human disease. He received his BA from Cornell University and his PhD in genomics from the University of Pennsylvania. He did his postdoctoral fellowship at the National Human Genome Research Institute under the mentorship of former NIH director, Dr. Francis Collins. In 2011, he was selected by Genome Technology as one of the nation's top 25 rising young investigators in genomics. Recently, Dr. Sethupathy has been named the American Diabetes Association Pathway to Stop Diabetes Research Accelerator. This award is only given to 3 people per year. Dr. Sethupathy is extremely productive as he has authored over 110 peer-reviewed publications in scientific journals and has served as a reviewer for over 40 different journals. In addition, he is an outstanding professor in teaching and mentoring students as he received a faculty merit at Cornell University. Dr. Sethupathy has been an invited speaker for the Veritas Forum and serves on the board of directors for the BioLogos Foundation. He articulates the harmony between science and faith with passion, civility, and rigor. We are so honored to have him speak at APU for the very first time today. Would you help me warmly welcome Dr. Sethupathy?
It's a pleasure for me to speak to you all as part of this special APU Center for Research and Science event. And I'm really honored that you'd take the time on a Wednesday evening to join this event. There's probably a lot that you could be doing. So I hope I can help make it worth your while. The topic of my lecture today is common ground between science and faith. And as Louise mentioned, the important subtext is, what does it mean to be human? But before I dive right in, I wanted to share first just a little bit about me. I'm a Christian, a scientist, with a Hindu background, Indian ancestry, Canadian birth, and naturalized American citizenship. So that's a lot to unpack, and I obviously won't get into most of that today. But what is most relevant for today is that as a scientist, I'm firmly committed to the pursuit of empirical knowledge, like making observations and gathering tangible data to test my hypotheses. On the other hand, I'm also a person of deep faith in Christ and in truths that I believe science alone cannot illuminate. I've committed my life to both science and faith, and they don't occupy separate parts of my brain. And as far as I know, they don't represent, multiple personalities. They really do seem to commingle as partners for me. A shared theme between my experiences as a scientist and as a person of faith is that I never stop learning. The entire stretch of human DNA was sequenced at the turn of the millennium, or at least the first draft of it. And when the announcement was made from the White House, the president referred to the genome as the most important, most wondrous map ever produced by humankind. It's been more than 20 years since then, and yet some of the most basic facts about DNA still give me goosebumps. For example, if you took DNA from just one cell of your body and you kind of stretched it out from end to end, it would take up about 6 feet, which is, much to my chagrin, taller than I am. Right? And if you took the DNA from all of the tens of trillions of cells in our body and stretched them out end to end, it would be hundreds of millions of miles. I mean, that's from the Earth to the sun and back many, many times over. That's a lot of material that's very, very tightly wound and packaged within the cells of just one human body. Just remarkable to me. I and many other geneticists have stared at the genome and studied small parts of it for months at a time. And often just when we think we've figured out how it works or what it's doing, we'll get a new clue in a different context, and we'll learn that it is far more complicated and multifunctional than we ever imagined. An extraordinary and very timely example of this is the subject of the 2020 Nobel Prize Award in Chemistry, CRISPR-Cas9 technology. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. It's been dubbed as genetic scissors because it can be used to cut and edit DNA. And this is an amazing innovation and came from the labs of Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier. And it actually stems from work that was done back in the 1980s to study how the DNA of bacteria is arranged. Scientists had found that some DNA in the bacterial genome that was kind of unexpected, unexplained at the time, and it looked a bit like random bits and pieces of DNA. But it was eventually discovered that far from being just random bits, these pieces of DNA actually represented a memory of the viruses that the bacteria had seen before. And this memory could be, harnessed to defeat the viruses if they ever showed up again. In just a matter of decades, there was this powerful transformation of our understanding of CRISPR from, sort of unexplained DNA junk to really powerful antiviral defense mechanisms. This has since, as some of you I'm sure are aware, inspired a technology to cure devastating diseases such as sickle cell anemia. All of this is a reminder that we've really only started to scratch at the surface of knowledge. And, the lifeblood of vibrant science, and by the way, I think this is true of vibrant faith as well, is the willingness to wrestle with hard questions that don't seem to have immediate or kind of pat answers. But I have to say that this was not my experience when I was asking difficult questions at the interface of science and faith as a graduate student. I couldn't really find many partners in my journey, either in the university or in my church. And I think we should be a little concerned when the academy or the church get too comfortable, too kind of relaxed in its ways, because I think this holds us back from making progress in science and from drawing closer to God. It can lead to a kind of groupthink mentality that I think can be kind of stagnating and unproductive. Task before me today is to speak on the common ground between science and faith from my perspective as a Christian and as a scientist. And, I know every generation of scientists says the same thing, so it's a little cliche, but I'm going to say it anyway here because I really feel it's true. It's an extraordinarily exciting time to do science, and I feel lucky to be in it. It feels like we're kind of at the edge of a new frontier, especially in areas like genomics and neuroscience, but even areas like environmental science and astronomy. But at the same time, we're also kind of at a cultural crossroads in terms of the role of science and scientists in shaping our worldviews, in helping us determine what's true and what's not. Some suggest that science is the kind of sole arbiter of truth and that it's our only foundation for human value and purpose. Others, on the other hand, are suspicious and wary of science because they believe that there's an agenda out there among many scientists to marginalize faith and faith-based communities. These very polarized responses in America, especially to the ongoing COVID pandemic right now, has kind of thrust this tension I'm speaking about right into the limelight. It's worth pointing out, though, that if viewed through the lens of specific individuals throughout history, this culture war that I'm talking about is a relatively recent one. Science and faith have actually long been very, very productive co-laborers in the pursuit of truth. I mean, if you want to learn more about this, I encourage you to consider the lives of many prominent thinkers and scholars in history. An example is Robert Boyle, one of the founders of modern chemistry, or Mary Anning, who changed the paradigm about prehistoric life, or Gregor Mendel, who is widely viewed as the father of modern genetics. These are scholars whose work was driven in part by a strong belief in a loving God of order and creativity. They didn't just happen to be Christian, but their faith motivated some of what they did. One very prominent individual who exemplifies this really well for me is Johannes Kepler. He's a famous German thinker and scientist from the 17th century, and he established the laws of planetary motion and is considered among the greatest astronomers and mathematicians the world has seen. In one of his most famous scientific treatises, Kepler starts with the following words I just think is remarkable. Quote, "I commence a sacred discourse, a most true hymn to God the founder, and I judge it to be piety, not to sacrifice many bulls to him or to burn incense of innumerable perfumes, but rather first to learn myself and afterwards to teach others too, how great he is in wisdom, in power, and of what sort in goodness." And then, it's a whole lot of math. But in another document, Kepler writes, "I was merely thinking God's thoughts after him. Since we astronomers," he says, "are priests of the highest God with regard to the book of nature, it benefits us to be thoughtful, not of the glory of our minds, but rather above all else of the glory of God." Kepler didn't fall into science and then kind of hope that science and faith could be partners. Kepler was actually driven to science by an insatiable desire to learn about and celebrate a creative God. The scientific lens, whatever it happened to reveal, it didn't push God out of Kepler's worldview, but it rather just gave him a window into just how amazing God is. To paraphrase the Belgic Confession of Faith, the universe is like a beautiful book, the study of which makes us ponder the invisible things of God. One of the key points I'm trying to make here is that there is a much richer, though somewhat ignored, history of partnership between science and faith than most people, especially students today, appreciate. Nonetheless, there are some commonly voiced issues that seem to prevent people from embracing the perspective that science and faith are harmonious. In the interest of time, I just want to highlight one of these to give you an idea of what I mean. And it's how we think about purpose or meaning. It is apparent that randomness is inherent to many phenomena in biology. This is often unsettling for people because it seems to suggest that there could be no larger purpose or meaning to our lives. However, one of the most stunning truths in biology is that apparently random processes lead to ordered, predictable outcomes all the time. A compelling example of this is the formation of each of our human bodies in our mother's womb. That is the process by which each of us develops from a single cell to a whole organism. It's been said that our cells play dice en route to becoming, a fully formed heart cell or lung cell or liver cell. But despite this sort of underlying stochastic nature, at the end of the process, a human body emerges every time. Of course, each of the human bodies is just a little bit different from one another's, but it's a human body nonetheless. How does this happen? An article in the journal Nature several years ago provided what I thought was a poetic answer. Quote, "If cells play dice, various geometric and temporal constraints on the cells can weight the dice, thus disrupting perfect randomness to convert noise into orchestrated sounds." In other words, Even apparently random processes are constrained by the parameters of the system in which they operate. And these constraints, authored by God, actually help shape the final outcome. Stochastic processes are not devoid of order and purpose, at least the way scientists think about it. Instead, operating under specified constraints, they can actually help weave a pretty beautiful and often reproducible tapestry. Today, I want to provide 3 concrete ways in which I have found that science and faith, specifically Christian faith, harmonize with each other: curiosity, humanity, and joy. And wrapped up in this will be a conversation about what it means to be human. Okay, so curiosity. How does scientific curiosity inform or even encourage one's faith? To answer this question, let's consider the COVID pandemic. As we know all too well, COVID is caused by a novel virus called SARS-CoV-2. And a common question over the past couple of years in the minds of many, from children to adults alike, has been, why would God create viruses? Embedded in this question is the assumption or the perception that viruses are bad, even evil. It's easy to understand this assumption, of course, because as a society, we really only talk about viruses when a pandemic like this hits. And especially in the midst of tragedy, when answers are so desperately needed, it's easy to kind of offer reflexive responses like linking viruses to the fall of man. They have a sort of biblical kind of sound to them, but ultimately they may not really deepen our understanding of the world or of God's wisdom. But curiosity, on the other hand, is all about challenging assumptions. So what happens when we dig a little deeper? What we learn is that human life as we know it would not exist without viruses. We wouldn't exist without viruses. To understand why, we have to actually first talk about bacteria. So bear with me a little bit, but I think you'll find this interesting. Bacteria represent the most abundant kind of microorganism in soil, right? In fact, in just a teaspoon of productive soil, you can find more than 1 billion bacteria. That's almost the population of the entire continent of Africa. Some soil and ocean bacteria, they're actually photosynthetic, meaning, of course, that they can produce and release much of the oxygen that we breathe. We're used to, thinking of plants and trees this way, but many don't realize that bacteria are actually responsible for the rise in oxygen levels in the Earth's atmosphere that eventually paved the way for oxygen-dependent life forms like me and you to inhabit the Earth. Even today, some scientists estimate that 10 to 20% of the oxygen we breathe is produced by just one particular species of photosynthetic bacteria. I mean, if you put this in another way, 1 in every 5 to 10 breaths that you and I take, we owe entirely to bacteria. But there's a problem, and that is that bacteria are very prolific multipliers. One particular strain you may know about, E. coli, can actually double its population every 20 minutes under the right conditions. So if you were to start out with just 2 bacteria and you let them reproduce, within the span of 1 day, there would be 10 to the 21 bacteria. So, it's no exaggeration to say that if left to themselves, bacteria would take over the Earth, leaving no room for us humans. So how does this get dealt with? Well, here's where viruses come in. It turns out that one of the main jobs of viruses is to keep bacteria in check. There are 10 to the 30 or so viruses in the world, and the vast majority of these don't interact with humans at all. Most of them are focused on attacking bacteria. So bacteria develop new strategies to evade viruses, and then viruses have to mutate and change in order to keep pace with the bacteria. And round it goes, all the time, all around us, completely undetected by our naked eye. There's this never-ending germ war. And we owe our lives to this germ war, right? Because without it, we wouldn't have our very breath. It's just the one problem is that every so often, very, very rarely, viruses can mutate in a way that enables them to infect humans and maybe even cause a pandemic. So here's our situation. We depend on viruses. We even need them to be adaptable so that they can keep up with bacteria and the germ war. But it is exactly this adaptability that creates the possibility of a pandemic in the human population. There is an inherent risk to life. But I think most of us will agree, even knowing this, that it's worth it. It's worth it because we get to know and be known. We get to love and be loved. And there's a kind of unspeakable beauty and wonder in that we experience. We started this section with the question, why would God even create viruses? But the curiosity to dig deeper, which, as I said, I believe is a shared value of science and faith, has led us to realize something about God. He creates beautifully balanced ecological systems where all sorts of diverse life forms can exist precisely because no one is given an ultimate upper hand over another. I like to think this is part of what God meant maybe when he looked at what he made and said, this is good. Okay, the second shared value, humanity. What makes us human? There's been this long-standing impulse in the scientific community to answer this question with biology, right? That is, to identify biological features of modern humans that appear to be unique to us. And one attempt has been at the anatomical or behavioral level. One kind of amusing example of this is bipedalism, or walking on two legs. It's true that among mammals, exclusive bipedal locomotion does set humans apart. In fact, though, even many ancient reptiles were almost assuredly bipedal. A prominent example is Eutybomus cursoris, which translates to the first two-legged runner, or something like that. Even some reptiles today can occasionally walk or run on 2 feet, an example of which is the South American basilisk lizard. And funnily enough, the other name, a common name for this lizard, is the Jesus Christ lizard, because it runs on 2 legs across water. At the behavioral level, tool making and empathy and cooperation, trickery, even conflict resolution, these have all been suggested as unique markers of humanity at some point or the other. But they've since been identified and, in fact, sometimes widely appreciated in other animals, particularly primates, but even in species less related to us, such as birds and hyenas. The more we learn, the fuzzier it seems to get in terms of how we can cleanly demarcate ourselves behaviorally from other animals. So then what about the cellular level? Could we define the human as a collection of human cells in which each human cell is defined by all of its contents? This seems compelling at first, but there's a problem with this approach. As many of you may already know, one of the most remarkable discoveries in human biology is that our bodies are home to tens of trillions of microorganisms, mostly bacteria. Tens of trillions. It's a staggering number. Because if you put it in another way, slightly more than half of the cells in the human body are not human at all. These bacteria live alongside and communicate with our human cells in a variety of organs, such as the skin or the intestine. And it turns out that they're not just there, they're actually critical for the healthy functioning of these organs. We couldn't properly absorb nutrients or maintain energy without the bacteria living inside us. So even these bacteria sort of obliterate a traditional view that a human can be defined by human cells alone. Even biologically, we're clearly more than that. Okay, so then what if we dig deeper? Right? What if we defined a human by DNA, the genome? Believe it or not, here too, we face a sticky problem. Littered throughout our genome are these genetic elements that originate from other species that we tend to think are completely unlike us. In fact, at least 10% of our human genome represents sequences from viruses that have integrated into our DNA over time. And that's a conservative estimate. Even at the genetic level, each of us is at least 1/10 virus. And, amazingly, viral DNA may have actually shaped some aspects of human biology that we take for granted today. For example, there's growing evidence to suggest that pieces of viral DNA inside our genome may actually have been co-opted to now contribute to the development of the human placenta. This is just fascinating to me, right? Viral DNA may have helped bring about an organ that is critical for nourishing a growing baby in the human womb. PBS was so taken by this that several years ago, they published a Nova Next article entitled "The Virus That Made Us Human." To me, this doesn't take away from God's authorship of our lives. Instead, it adds a wonderfully surprising color to the truth of Psalm 139, that God knit us together in our mother's womb. Who am I to say that God cannot use viruses to accomplish this? The bottom line is that biology has brought to light a fundamental connectedness among different life forms and even links all of us intimately to the air that we breathe and the earth on which we walk. Some have argued that this points to the insignificance of humankind. In fact, it's not unlike the famous sentiment shared by Cornellian Carl Sagan, one of the world's most brilliant astrophysicists, who said, after a lifetime of studying the universe, "Who are we humans? We find that we live on an insignificant planet of a humdrum star, lost in a galaxy tucked away in some forgotten corner of a universe in which there are far more galaxies than people." How does that view compare with what the Bible says about what it means to be human? Well, to start with, I believe we should be very careful not to read the Bible as though it were a scientific text. But that said, it's pretty striking to me that humans are sometimes described in exactly the same terms as other animals. In Genesis 1, humans and animals are both created on day 6. I mean, we don't even get a separate day in that account. In Genesis 2, humans and other creatures are both referred to as nefesh chaya, which is often translated as living soul or living organism. So many Bible scholars have argued that even this idea of soul may not be uniquely human. Also in Genesis 2, humans are created from the dust of the ground, which is exactly the way the formation of other animals is also described. When it comes to the stuff we're made of, whether we're talking about Genesis or genetics, it seems we can't really escape that there's a fundamental connectedness among all animals, including humans. The book of Ecclesiastes actually puts it rather poetically, just as the animals, from dust we came, and to dust we shall return. From a purely material standpoint, I think there's actually more agreement between science and Christian faith than most realize. So then, according to Genesis, is there anything else that sets humans apart? Well, during the telling of how the universe came to be, the phrase image of God is used for only one species: humans. The Hebrew word used for image in Genesis, it's the same word that's used to describe royal images that a king would set up all across his kingdom when he was not physically present. Bible scholar and theologian Dr. Richard Middleton, he defines the image of God in his book, The Liberating Image, which I strongly encourage for anybody interested in this topic, as the royal office of human beings as God's representatives and agents in the world. We're called to manifest and channel the character and presence of God, priestly service toward the rest of creation. My reading is that the image of God is not primarily a biological feature, but rather a vocational calling that has been gifted to us. In other words, according to Genesis, it's not so much what we're made of, but rather the priestly and creative partnership that we're called to that fundamentally sets us apart from the rest of biological life. So it's worth noting that Scripture is actually not entirely at odds with Carl Sagan. In terms of astronomy, we are indeed very small specks in the universe. And in terms of biology and DNA, we do share more with other life forms than we ever anticipated. Scripture would affirm that the significance of humanity doesn't arise from our material bodies, nor our place in the universe, but rather in the value God Himself places on us. Why does He value us? It turns out that has very little to do with who we are and what we're made of, and everything to do with who He is. He chooses to value us. He even chooses to partner with us as His image bearers. This is an important theological point, And it may be different in emphasis from science, but I find it to still be perfectly harmonious with the claims of science. Third, shared value brings me to joy, the other way that science harmonizes with Christian faith. I believe it is not only the calling to reflect God's character that makes us human. I think there's another important piece to the puzzle, and it's not Genesis, but instead Psalm 104 that helps reveal it. Most of the verses about creation in Psalm 104, they seem to emphasize the purpose that the created entities serve. The water, to quench the thirst of the wild donkeys, the grass as food for the cattle, and the trees as homes for the birds, and so on. But one day when I was reading this psalm, one verse stood out to me. Verse 26 says that the Leviathan was created simply so it could play in the water. It reminds us that while part of God's wisdom in creation is definitely order and purpose, another part is simply for the fun and pleasure of it. He takes delight in his Leviathan, which he formed apparently just so it could take delight in the oceans. I wondered if this should color the way I read the entire psalm, so going back through it, I suddenly saw the theme of joy woven throughout, right? The gushing forth of springs, the singing of the birds, the wine that gladdens the human heart, the oil that makes our face shine. These all make it clear that God makes things not just to satisfy needs like hunger and thirst, but also for pure enjoyment. And I think herein lies a core truth of the Christian faith, that at the heart of creation is God's joy. God has been taking immense pleasure in his creation from the very beginning. And mankind is that unique slice of creation that gets to delight in creation right alongside our Creator. We, uniquely, get to peer into and make known what Ephesians 3:10 calls the manifold wisdom of God, and thereby draw nearer to God's joy in the experience of creation. I want to dwell for just a moment here on this word manifold. It's kind of a boring word in English, right? It's just a combination of many and fold. But the word that Paul uses in Greek here is Poiquilos, which is not used anywhere else as far as I know in the New Testament. The second half of the word Poiquilos means multicolored, often in the context of embroidery. So for example, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, this Poiquilos would be used to describe Joseph's many-colored coat. But this word is also used in 1 Peter and James, but not with the polu in front of it. Here, Paul puts the polu, making polupoikilos. And so it almost means a multitude of multicolor, right? It's almost as though Paul couldn't control himself and is just being extremely effusive, so much so that he sort of makes up a word. This word is meant to evoke a sense of awe and wonder and how great God is, how unsearchably vast and intricate his wisdom is, just how tremendously multifaceted and diverse his plans are. For me, at the end of the day, this is a lot of what the scientific enterprise is about. It doesn't detract from my humanity, it encourages it. It persuades me every day to open my eyes to the overabundance, almost prodigal amount of created things all around us. The sheer vastness of the created order and the diversity and complexity of created things is just awe-inspiring. And I think we're meant to explore, to wonder, to be in awe in a way that I believe no other animal is. As we get older, though, I think we far too easily assume an overly kind of pragmatic or utilitarian view of the world. But actually, it's all there, at least in part, simply because God enjoys it. And as humans made in his image, I think we're called to discover it and enjoy it too. Taking deep pleasure in creation strongly links my experience as a scientist and as a Christian. Sometimes in our weaker moments, we're beset by fear of the unknown in the world around us. But as Scripture teaches, we're called to seek out the perfect love that drives out fear. As the ending line in the famous poem by Sarah Williams goes, "I have loved the stars too fondly to be fearful of the night." In our stronger moments, inquiry into natural world invariably leads to awe. O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the works thy hands have made. I want to end tonight with two strikingly similar quotes from two very different men. The first is from Henri Poincaré, who's a brilliant French mathematician and scientist of the 19th century who happened to be atheist. He said, "The scientist does not study nature just because it is useful to do so. He studies it, and I might add, she studies it, because he takes pleasure in it. And he takes pleasure in it because it is beautiful." Although he was an atheist, he could not escape the feeling that humans seem to have a unique privilege of experiencing wonder and delight in nature. The second quote was spoken by Jonathan Edwards, great American theologian of the 18th century. "All the beauty to be found throughout the whole creation is but the reflection of the diffused beams of that being who has an infinite fullness of brightness and glory." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sethupathy. I am thrilled to introduce our panelists today, Dr. Mihretu Guta and Dr. Regina Trammel. Dr. Mihretu Guta completed his PhD at Durham University in the United Kingdom. He was a postdoctoral research fellow within the Durham Emergence Project and set up a cooperation between physicists and philosophers. Currently, Dr. Guta teaches philosophy at APU, Biola University, and Addis Ababa University. His research interest areas include analytic metaphysics, philosophy of mind, bioethics, philosophical theology, the philosophy of cognitive neuroscience, and the philosophy of quantum physics. He has many publications, including Selfhood, Autism, and Thought Insertion, Consciousness and the Ontology of Properties, and Taking Persons Seriously, Where Philosophy and Bioethics Intersect. We look forward to hearing his thoughts on the ontology of being human. Our other panelist, Dr. Regina Trammel, is an associate professor in the Master of Social Work program at APU. Dr. Trammel received her BA from Occidental College, her MSW from the University of Central Florida, and her PhD from Baylor University. Dr. Trammel has spent more than a decade in private practice, as well as experience in psychiatric and medical social work settings. She's an avid mindfulness practitioner, has academic research publications on Christian mindfulness, a popular TEDx talk on mindfulness, and just released a new book, A Counselor's Guide to Christian Mindfulness, Engaging the Mind, Body, and Soul in Biblical Practices and Therapies. And we also look forward to Dr. Trammel's thoughts on the praxis of being human. And now I'm going to turn the mic over first to Dr. Guta.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here tonight. We had just a wonderful presentation from our keynote speaker. And I just want to briefly talk about what it means to be a human being or a person taken from the ontological or metaphysical point of view. So the question for this webinar seems very simple. So what is human? And we can answer this question from multiple dimensions. If we are scientists, we can just hop onto the biological definition and say, well, we talk about the anatomy and everything, as our keynote speaker actually wonderfully presented. We can talk about all the intricacies and complexities that really are associated with what it means to be a human being from biological point of view. But I think this question is extremely simple, but it does not really come with a very simple answer. We can't give a simple answer. It's a simple question that requires a complicated, layered responses. We can approach this question from theological point of view. We can talk about Imago Dei, the image of God. We can approach this question from scientific point of view, from political point of view, from social point of view, from cultural point of view, and from, as I've said, philosophical or metaphysical point of view. So when we put all of these multi-layered, multiple dimensions together, we will get a complex answer. Those complex answers also give rise to complex questions, and then it takes us to a whole new level. But I just want to say very briefly what it means to be a person. What is a human from metaphysical or ontological standpoint? we are certain kinds of entities. We are entities with not only physical properties, but also with non-physical properties. We have mental states, we have consciousness, and consciousness is one of the most complicated phenomenon. It's a very simple thing, to be conscious. I am conscious. Each one of you is conscious right now. And when we ask ourselves what this consciousness is, and we will end up opening a Pandora box, and all kinds of complex issues will arise. But one thing that we cannot really deny is, since we are subjects of experience, since we are some kind of entities with multiple properties, physical as well as mental, I think it's fair to say that from ontological point of view, we are a special kinds of beings. So everything that our keynote speaker talked about, curiosity or humanity or joy or all sorts of those things, can only happen if and only if we have some kind of mental capacity and ability to think, ability to analyze things, ability to evaluate things, ability to draw logical conclusions, ability to predict what might happen in the future based on our present work, the ability to assess what we did in the past. So all of these complex capacities, as far as I know, are unique to human beings. And we don't really see other non-human species getting together worrying about political state of, about the state of the global politics, about economic recession, or studying DNA, or what does DNA imply? We are the only creatures who are incredibly interested in figuring out, the things around us, figuring out what the environment around us is all about. And we have a capacity to do that. We are thinkers, and we are not brute animals. We just fill up our stomach, we have our lunch, and our stomach is full, and we just lie down all day long until the next cycle begins. That's not what we do as human beings. We are deeply curious human beings. Therefore, we are special kinds of entities. Of course, we have a biological side to us. Of course, we are animals. But Aristotle told us that long time ago, we are not brute animals. We are rational animals. There is an undeniable aspect about our own animality, our body, the constituent parts of our bodies, particles. All of those things composed us as they compose anything else around us. But then there is something incredibly unique about us, that we do things that other animals are not able to do. So therefore, what it means to be a person, what it means to be a human being, should be answered fundamentally from metaphysical standpoint, or from ontological standpoint. It takes to be the kinds of entities that we are to be able to do what we are able to do. So therefore, it is important to really put this hierarchy here. Of course, scientific description is wonderful. Of course, political description or social description or cultural description is wonderful. But metaphysical description lays a fundamental foundation for who we are, to answer the question what human beings are. We are conscious human beings. We have consciousness in a very, very special sense. We have the ability to think about ourselves. We have the capacity for self-reflection, for example. I think about myself. And those of you who have wonderful dogs, I don't think dogs have self-concept in the sense that we do have self-concept. Of course, they are brilliant creatures, and they are aware of things that happen around them. But I don't think dogs sit down and say, okay, I am Mihretu. Oh, I am a dog. Okay, who am I? What's my destiny? Where am I heading? Where did I come from? All of these metaphysical existential questions are very, very unique to us. And we're not satisfied with only physical things. And physical things really do not satisfy us that much. Therefore, I believe that we are unique creatures. And I think fundamentally we have to understand about this from a metaphysical point of view. And thank you so very much. And I think we will be able to think about these issues in a much deeper way when the Q&A question time comes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Guta. I'd like to build on this question of what is human from a social science perspective. And in the social sciences, and particularly as someone who is really interested in kind of the systemic, holistic idea of what is human, I believe, and research shows that we are body, mind, and soul as humans. Just as Dr. Sethupathy really wonderfully demonstrated and helped us understand that it's difficult to define us just alone by our bodies, just alone by our minds, our neurons, our cells, and maybe even arguably just by our souls. But what makes us unique, I believe, is that we experience the world through each of these systems, and there is holistic interaction between these parts of ourselves. And as Dr. Guta just talked about, we are conscious of the way these systems interact. This holistic system of humanity means that we relate to the world through these systems, and they each reflect how complex we are as humans and how much dignity is stamped on us as image bearers of God. We understand that to be human is that we can all be experiencing the same thing, but gleaning different facts, different meaning, different applications. In fact, the way each human being processes experiences are shaped by how we engage our minds, how we engage our bodies, or even our spiritual self and soul in that present moment. In the study and application of mindfulness, we find that our human limits are very present and we acknowledge them. That being human also means we're limited in our capacities of mind and our body and our spirit. And these limits are not to dishearten us, they're really to point us to our Creator as our sustainer. Part of being human also means that our limits do not impede how we can drink deeply of this life, this side of heaven. The way we understand how we move about in the world and our interactions with others can be more deeply experienced on a personal level. For example, you're all experiencing this webinar, and we're doing this together at the same time, but each of you is processing this event differently from your vantage point. And if we were to compare stories about this webinar experience, I think we would get many different versions. In our complex systems, the way we take in the information depends on a myriad of factors that social scientists study that speak deeply of humanity. The way our minds work is a complex neurological system that is shaped by our caregivers, as well as the way we were nurtured and cared for. Likewise, our society impacts how humanely we are treated, depending on our social location and environmental impacts. How we survive and thrive as humans is shaped by our access to resources, and also the dignity others confer or even do not confer on us. Part of being human also means we can transcend present moment realities. We're motivated by other immaterial factors. As the writer of Hebrew puts it, now faith is a substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Social scientists often also study the motivation behind human behavior. There's something deeply, uniquely human about us as we think about character virtues and meaning, how we define purpose, how we define transcendent values such as hope, honesty, beauty, curiosity, and joy, as Dr. Sethupathy helped us understand earlier. These are uniquely human features that many of us strive for, define, and live out. And these things are features that animals or artificial intelligence struggle to define and are also not even motivated towards as an end. The last unique feature of humanity that I want to mention is how important our social connections are for human flourishing. Like our Trinitarian God, as we reflect Him, we find elation in social connectedness. Connectedness helps us transcend just the I into the we. In fact, we cannot survive or thrive as humans without these interactions. Our bodies co-regulate, meaning when we are in the company of others, we sync up with each other in our minds and neurology, our bodies, and even our souls. Being human means we are simply intertwined creatures who are in need of each other, and we are at our best when we function as the we, rather than just the individual I alone.
Thank you, panelists, for providing us with some helpful background information. I can tell we're going to have a robust conversation with all three of you, if you would join me now, as if we were in a living room with all these wonderful people joining us from around the world. For the sake of fostering an organic conversation, I will address each of you by your first name. And audience, thank you for submitting questions. Please continue to do so in the Q&A box. Let us start with the first question. Is there any human situation or condition that diminishes Imago Dei in any human? In other words, is Imago Dei inherently or intrinsically fixed? Feel free to take turn to answer that.
I think this is a really, really important question, and it underscores one of the points I was trying to make, which is that there is actually a danger if we rely too heavily on biological aspect of who we are for defining humanity, that we could say, well, if we lean too heavily on our cognitive abilities, what about those among us who may have been born with disabilities as it pertains to their mental health or their cognitive capabilities? Are they any less made in the image of God? And my answer would be an emphatic no. Right? Not only because I know very little about the unique and wonderful and lovely ways in which they may connect with God that I know nothing about, right? So even leaving that aside, I think just fundamentally, ontologically, as Mihretu was saying so nicely, we are made in the image of God, fearfully, wonderfully made by Him, and irrespective of where various biological traits fall on the spectrum, the calling to reflect and represent Him is upon all of us intrinsically, right? And no biological feature, I think, changes the extent to which we are made in the image of God or have been gifted that vocational calling.
I would like to add to reinforce what Praveen said. I think there is a huge controversy right now, and especially bioethics. What is a person? And one of the views defended by, for example, bioethicists like Peter Singer, Michael Tooley, and others is, we are literally amalgamation of our own cognitive capacities. And once we lose those capacities, we will no longer maintain our status as persons. So here's a very simple example. These philosophers make a distinction between a human being and a human person. A human person. What's the difference between a human and a human person? A human being is a pure biological organism. But a human person is unique from a human because a human person has a high level of cognitive capacities. So one person can start off by being a human being and becomes a human person, loses that personhood along the way when the capacities are gone, let's say through dementia or all these neurodegenerative diseases, and that person will no longer be perceived as human person. Therefore, abortion, killing those guys, getting rid of them is not morally questionable, move to take. So therefore, it's extremely important, as Praveen has pointed out, to think that we are not amalgamation of our capacities, and we cannot be reduced to our cognitive capacities. We might lose them, all of them. I might lose all of my memory. It does not mean I'm less a human being than someone whose memory system is still intact. So therefore, we need to think about this issue very carefully. And this is exactly where metaphysics kicks in. And so we cannot be reduced to our capacities. Of course, we need our capacities in order to function in a way that we function as human beings. They are incredibly important things. But we are not those capacities. So therefore, we are a distinct entities created in the image of God. And therefore, whether we have them, if we lose them because of disease, we still remain as human beings. Therefore, I think that's a very important point. I just wanted to reinforce that.
Great. Regina.
Yeah, just sticking with this question, I think what's really important is kind of the contrast between what we're hearing from Praveen and Mihretu about what's inherently assigned to us, right, by God. But I think the way that we process and evaluate meaning and that dignity really has to do a lot with some of our social relationships and kind of external factors. Even history has pointed out that we have used biological facts to discriminate and to uphold racist ideas of other human beings. Biology and DNA studies have been used against other humans to dehumanize and to confront issues of dignity that is already assigned by God to us, to all of us. And I think what's really important is to think about how do resources and scarcity of resources contribute to the meaning and purpose and idea of how we confer dignity on each other. And there's an interplay, therefore, right, of how we define human beyond just, our biological, our cognitive abilities, but our social location, our gender, our race, our ethnicity, our culture. And I think I think we see that in society, right? These discussions that happen. So I think, yes, it is inherent. As Christ followers, we embrace that, but it's always threatened by a myriad of factors.
Thank you. We just have a great question came into the Q&A box. Do you think humans are the only creation capable of sin? If so, do you think this is defining characteristic of being human? How are we supposed to grapple with being image bearers of God if God cannot associate with sin?
I do think that is the case. The sin means to miss the mark. What does it mean to have a mark? Right? Part of the mark that we have is the calling that has been placed on us. Right? But what we learn in Christian theology is that we're all missing it, right? And without utter and complete dependence on Christ, we will miss it, right? Because he is the only one who is good. He is the only one who is perfect. All meant to redirect and reorient us back to Christ and into a dependent and loving relationship with him. But I think that's unique to us. I think that comes back to part of being made in the image of God. God loves all of his creation, and I have no doubt about that. And I think he deeply enjoys, remember the Leviathan. I think he enjoys his creation, but that's different from saying that he has a really unique image-bearing relationship with a part of his creation. I think that's only for us. And when we reject the calling, the flip side of that first question that was asked, is image of God intrinsic to us? Yes, it is, but we can reject it, right? If it's a calling, if I'm right about thinking of it that way, at least in part, we can reject the calling. It's still there. It's still gifted to us, right? And therefore, we're still made in his image, but we may reject it or choose to not partake of it. So I'll leave it there and love to hear what the others have to say.
I would like to add to what has been said already. I think one of the things that we need to keep in our mind in answering this question is the fact that God created us as not only social beings, but also as moral beings. So the fact that we are being created as moral beings is exactly what puts us in a position either to be able to have this capacity to sin or not. And animals are not moral beings, non-human animals. We can't take our dog to a court. We can't take our cow to a court. Let's suppose your dog kills a neighbor or something like that. No one is going to drag your dog to a court and the judge is addressing the dog. But you will be liable for that. You will be responsible for that. And so the first thing really to make sure that we understand about this question is, why did God create us as moral beings? For whatever reason, he created us as moral beings. So that's exactly what puts us in a position. As a moral being, if I violate God's rules, if I mistreat other people, if I become unfair to other people, and so on, of course, that's a reflection of what we mean by sin. So therefore, I would say that we are the only creatures as moral beings. Of course, angels can be said to be moral beings as well, because they are fallen angels. But other non-human animals are not moral beings, therefore they are not capable of sinning. So they have no notion of sinning, no notion of breaking the rules and so on. But those of you who have dogs, you might dispute with me saying, well, I do have tons of rules in my house for my dog and blah, blah. But those are really mechanically carried out activities. And you can mechanically train your dog, but does not mean that the dog literally has a concept of, oh, I've become moral being, therefore I will be lying. No, it's just a mechanical stuff. So therefore, I think the key is we are moral beings. And I think what it means to be a moral being is part of the package of what it means to be created in the image of God. And that's why we are the only creatures who are capable of sinning.
Yes, I agree with the fellow panelists. I think what really separates us is exactly what Mihretu said, which is this idea of morals and ethics. And I think these are higher level order kind of cognitive skills. There's a self-reflective skill that animals do not possess. And animals are often motivated by these sort of instincts, right? This mechanism that Mihretu talked about. But we are often motivated, as I talked about earlier, and Praveen talked about earlier, kind of these transcendent kind of values and purpose. And so sin, therefore, is almost a violation of that kind of purpose that God has assigned to us as image bearers. And it's just not assigned to animals in the same way.
Thank you. This next question probably is directed to Praveen, but feel free to jump in. First, thank you for speaking today. I like your evaluation of what a human is compared to other biological life. However, I am curious as to how this evaluation compares to artificial intelligence and what you might foresee as potential questions the church might have to face when dealing with something human-like, if, of course, AI to that level is even possible.
What an amazing question. I hope I don't disappoint, because I'm afraid I don't have a pat answer for this one, although I can say that it is an important question. It's a good question. It's one that we should be wrestling with as a Christian community all across the world, because whether we like it or not, or appreciate it or not, we are coming into that era, right? And so we need to think carefully about what that means for our society. I think one thing is we're often pretty impressed and captivated by what things do as opposed to what they are, which is what I like about this conversation that we're having. And I think we start to think that if machines get closer and closer to the kinds of things that we can do, that they're basically us, right? And I would challenge that notion, right? With all humility, because perhaps I surely can't divine exactly what AI is going to look like in 50, 60, 100 years. But from my vantage point, I would challenge that way of thinking to say, even if we create things that are very, very similar to the kinds of things we can do physically, biologically, even to some extent emotionally, that doesn't mean that God looked upon them and said, let us make man in our image. Right? That's something different altogether. Right? And without any special additional revelation than what I have now or from Scripture, I would be very hesitant to say that that is now a human. That's not for me to say. That's for God to say, right? And without knowing that God has said that or any special revelation of such, I don't think that is human, right? I mean, we do still get into really challenging questions if we deviate just a little bit from AI and talk about clones, right? Again, we don't know where we're going to be technologically, but just, for argument's sake, if we are in a position to be able to clone ourselves, beyond the ethical questions, of course, of whether we should, would those clones be human? It does start to get really, really challenging. But again, I would really lean heavily on Mihretu's approach of thinking about what we are and who made us that, right? And who called that into existence beyond just the biological elements of what we are and what we're able to do. I will say just one tiny more thing, and that is what should the church be grappling with? I think sometimes there's this tendency to say, wow, this is very scary, AI is bad. Or, my gosh, look at all the awesome things AI is doing, AI is so good. I don't actually think AI is bad or good. Like any tool or like any technology, it's just a tool or a technology. It's all about how we choose to use it. What is our motivation for how we are leveraging it? Right? Is it helping us to love our neighbor as ourselves? Because if it is, and that's our motivation and intention, I'd say that's good, right? But if it isn't, if a check of ourselves suggests that that's not the intention or the motivation, then it would be bad. So I think that's why Christians need to be in this conversation so that we can force the question. We don't just do things because we can, but we force the question, why are we doing this? What is our motivation? And what is our collective consensus in society about whether that motivation is healthy for who we are as people?
If I could just jump in really quick with an example, of how AI can, in some sense, I agree, definitely, Praveen, that there's such a difference. And it will be interesting, like you said, how it will evolve. But for instance, in my field, AI is already used as a tool of therapy. So people who have mental health challenges, who need an empathetic listening voice, that humans, we want to connect. But I think I would say, even using your pastor example in the question, there's a difference between intellect and knowledge and presence, right? And empathy and caring and co-creating meaning with someone. And I don't think AI is going to be capable of that because, again, we're missing the soul element of AI versus the human, right? They might have a body, they might have a mind. Their mind might be highly intelligent, much more intelligent than ours. In fact, already, I think we've crossed that threshold, right? AI has already beat a human in Go, the most complicated game, right? Very, very quickly and very easily. So we're talking about something that we don't want to underestimate their intelligence, but presence, empathy, I think the kind of ineffable intangibles, I think, are not going to be surpassed.
May I add something here, because I am working, I'm very much involved in AI research from a philosophical point of view, and I had a couple of opportunities to present my work in different places. I think there is a metaphysical hurdle here. Of course, AI is not bad when it comes to weak AI. Weak AI, everything that we're using, the robotic technology and what they are helping us to do and to speed up our work and so forth, that's all fun. But when it comes to a strong AI is highly philosophically motivated research area where we can prove and show that gadgets will be superior to us. In fact, they will hire us as their pets at some point. So it's an attempt to achieve higher intelligence, super intelligence, and super longevity, and so forth. I think that is not going to be materialized for metaphysical reasons, because we are the ones who are creating these gadgets. They didn't really sprout from the ground. We write the programs, we come up with a sophisticated way to put them together so that they will be able to do what they are able to do. It's a number crunching system. In some sense, there is nothing surprising about AI, but there is everything surprising about us. They are the brainchild of us. So therefore, metaphysically, we are their gods. We've created them. Suppose, for example, AI gadgets start giving rise to other AI creatures, like the way that we human beings do biologically. Still, we maintain our ontological superiority over them because the buck stops with us. We created them. We made them to be able to do what they are able to do. So there is no mystery there. But it speaks volumes about us. It speaks incredible things about us. How on earth 3-pound weighing organ inside our skull is able to really put all of these things together? I'm not saying we are our brains, but what I'm saying is the brain really plays a great role in facilitating what we do. even if we are not human beings. Therefore, I would strongly argue, and I will be happy to deal with anyone who thinks otherwise, that somehow AI 20 years, 100 years from now, they will do incredible things. Yeah, they do incredible things, but who made them to do what they are doing? Us. So therefore, it's a reflection of our creativity, our ingenuity, and our knowledge, and so on. So therefore, let us appreciate ourselves, not what we've actually produced, because those are, the handiwork of human beings. So therefore, I really would like to argue that there is a metaphysical, unbridgeable gap when it comes to proving the metaphysical assumptions of strong AI researchers. So therefore, I would like to say that I don't think that's metaphysically possible.
Great, thank you. I think we cover a lot of grounds in that round of response. So I want to switch gear a little bit. There are quite a few questions about biology and biology-related questions. This next one asks, gene alteration to correct defective genes is towards preserving life. Eugenics for selective traits is questionable. How does this all temper in the principle of Imago Dei?
Yeah, I agree that this is a really important question. And I'm very appreciative of how the question was asked as well, because sometimes out of fear, we can throw the baby out with the bathwater, if you will, and say, well, you know what, genome editing, since there's some scary potential applications, we shouldn't be considering it at all. And yet the questionnaire here understands that there are life-saving applications of this remarkable technology that can revolutionize medicine in incredibly positive ways. I alluded in my talk to sickle cell anemia. It's not cured by CRISPR-Cas9 genome editing at the moment, but there are genome editing-based trials that are underway, and individuals who have been treated in that way are still doing well, as far as I know. And this has been nothing short of revolutionary for a disease that is so gripping for so many in the human population. So the opportunity to use a technology like this to save life and bring quality of life like that is, my gosh, may it happen as soon as possible, right? And I hope that we would all be on board with that. But if we want to, go to the clinic and have blue-eyed, blonde-haired children, and we want to, do genome editing for trait selection, we should all get a little worried about that kind of talk, right? Designer babies, as it has been said, right? So again, like with AI, I think we need to sit down and think carefully about how this technology is being used and where we draw the line as a culture. And I'm not saying that's going to be easy, but I'm not even certain it's really been done, right? So we do need to sit down together, scientific agencies, religious-minded communities, come together in this nation and internationally to ask the question about where we see this technology as a clear benefit from a medical standpoint, where we still see it as an ethically blurry area, and therefore more conversation and discussion is required before we step forward. And then, of course, where we still see it as dangerous scientifically and should definitely require more investigation and research. I think those categories need to be laid out. While there may be some things that are blurry and gray that we'll disagree on, I think we'll actually find that overwhelmingly, the kinds of things that come up, we're going to find broad consensus. What does this impact Imago Dei? I think this has more to do with whether we destroy or rather reject Imago Dei in ourselves, right? So if, again, we use this technology as a means by which to discriminate, as a means by which to commit eugenics and trait selection, as a means by which, these are things that have come up over and over again, not only in all of the examples we all know about, but even within scientific communities in America. And I think we need to be cognizant and publicly talking about these things so as to prevent them from happening again and maximize the use of these technologies for loving your neighbor, for life-saving ways.
I think I completely agree with what Praveen said. I think it's important to keep in mind that simply because we can do X, it does not mean that we should do X. That a very simple logical principle is lost on so many people. I understand that, as Praveen told us, scientific domain is a hugely growing and area of research. And I think we have to thank God for the wisdom that God has given for scientists and for all the good things that they are doing. That's wonderful. I think that there's nothing wrong with that. But I think at the same time, we human beings are also incredibly evil people. We can do a lot of damage as well. So scientific curiosity shouldn't be a driving force in and of itself. So there is something that we call ethics. There are certain things that we ought not do. There are certain things that we ought do, and there are certain things that are neutral. So my recommendation is that I think scientists, they have to work in close collaboration with ethicists and philosophers and religious people and so on, where those things are important to do. So I think scientists shouldn't have this mindset, leave us alone, and as long as we get grant and we can do whatever we want, we can pursue whatever we want, and we can use other people as guinea pigs and just enjoy ourselves. No, I think that should be completely monitored very closely. And I think ethics is very important. I think my recommendation, as I've said, is just to really be to collaborate, not as opposed to in our own cubicles, secluded and leave me alone. That kind of mentality is very, very dangerous. And I think my recommendation is let's work together and explore this world together. And where we shouldn't really do certain things, we shouldn't do them. Even if that means it will put a stop to our own curiosity. And curiosity shouldn't be infinite pursuit of whatever we want to do. And that's madness. And there has to be a sense in which there are certain things that are obvious enough and we shouldn't do them, period. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
It sounds like to me, de-siloing and be really conscious of the fact that we are in community, whether or not we're close by or not. I'm gonna go to this next question, a little bit switch gear. Roughly speaking, humanism believes that education, fine arts, and reasoning can save humanity, and so we don't need God. In light of the advancement in technology, like artificial intelligence, this idea seems to be discussed more lately on defining what humanity is. What are your thoughts on humanism in relation to faith?
If we're talking about humanism as sort of almost kind of this philosophical or theoretical branch of investigating, what it means to be humanity, I think, a common theory within that branch is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Where we're always kind of pursuing this sort of self-actualization. So we see the arts, we see philosophy as kind of a pinnacle of humanity. As I'm talking, kind of the Tower of Babel comes to mind, right? Like all of us in our human capacity, trying to build something bigger than us, having more meaning than us. And so I think we can get caught up, right? There's always this temptation then to start looking at what we built, look at the AI, look at how intelligent, kind of going back to what Mihretu says, wow, we are still, it's human ingenuity that has driven us to these pinnacles of success. But obviously, right, as Christians, as Christ followers, what happened to the Tower of Babel, I think humility comes. And I think there is a danger with AI. I'll come back to that conversation a little bit, or even just kind of CRISPR technology, where I think we underestimate as humans our biases, our need to use power, and really basically without God, live in a very animal kingdom sort of way, where we do want to exert our power and influence over others. And that's a natural, I would say, that's actually a very natural human instinct. If we go into theology, that's natural to be sinful in that regard. So I think the natural tendency without faith would be absolutely to not need God. I think humanism in itself isn't necessarily open to notions of God. But as Christ follows, I think there's a way to synthesize, this idea of, wow, God has given us this great capacity to create. And that ability to have beautiful art, beautiful music, symphonies, I should reflect the fact that we are image bearers.
I think briefly to add to what Regina beautifully put is, first of all, the claim that we don't really need God is a claim that presupposes, in fact, strongly entails that we are or we can be self-sufficient, right? So leave us alone and we can prove that we are who we think we are or who we think we should be or something like that. I think one of the interesting issues that we can attach to this very assumption is that, look, we are not responsible for our own existence. I mean, I did not create myself, for example, and I did not create the environment around me. How did I get here? Okay, I mean, I don't deserve any credit. So whatever human beings will achieve in the future, what they have achieved in the past, what they are achieving at present, none of that will add up to proving the point that, yeah, look, now I've answered the question that I have created myself for. No, I am a passive recipient of my own existence. So therefore, there are metaphysical issues that we have to face on head on. Where does this universe come from? How did we get here? How did we end up here? The fact that we think that we are self-sufficient is really a knee-jerk reaction to me. So we have to first tackle the fundamental, metaphysical issues. And what answers do we have about the existence of the universe? What answers do we have about our own existence? And science is not going to answer that question. And science is in fact lucky, because without natural world, there would not be any science. Without a kind of consciousness that we have, we would not have been able to do what we are able to do, what we will continue to do in the future, and so on. So therefore, I think humanism is just declaring. I take it like as a slogan, but it does not really touch on the basic fundamental questions for me. Thank you.
Well, this may be our last question. Speaking of worldview, in our culture, productivity is highly valued in our worldview. How does such value play a role in who we are as a race?
I think that overvaluing productivity diminishes who we are as humans, because we begin to treat ourselves as machines, as just producers. And I think as the conversation we've been having today makes clear, we're far more than that. I mean, that's a part of who we are, but we're far more than that. Right? When God, in the telling of God making the world, God keeps repeating, "This is good," right? And as image bearers, I've often thought that perhaps a part of this calling that we have that is so unique is to participate in exploring the world to figure out why it's good, and then to make that known, right? Even that Kepler quote of like figuring it out and then thinking God's thoughts after him and then teaching others. There's just something so uniquely human about that experience, and it involves wonderment and awe and reflections on beauty, things that I think are uniquely human. There's this William Henry Davies poem that some of you may know, and it says, it's a poor life this is, right? If full of care, we have no time to stand and stare, right? And that's the opposite of productivity, the way that we define it in the world, and yet I think there's something so beautifully human about that.
I think we need to embrace our limits. I don't know if there's time. I'm sorry to jump in, Louise. Okay. I think we need to embrace our limits because, and just with current events, right? The Great Resignation, we're seeing this kind of play out. Things like burnout. That we are. God made us with limits. I think it's so interesting that our faith is the only faith where God Himself came in a body incarnate, right? When even just the idea of a body, right, is limited. our bodies age. We can't be in two places at once. There's something to learn about our limits. So productivity should be a means to a different end, a higher order end. Productivity for productivity's sake, I think we're seeing some of the fallout from that in our society already.
Yeah, I just want to add a few things. Productivity is okay. I mean, in and of itself, it's not a bad thing, but I think productivity can be an idol. So the temptation is, I have meaning insofar as I am productive to the X extent, or in this way, or in that way. So my entire existential value is predicated upon how much I achieve and so on. I think that's deeply unscriptural. And I think God wants us to take time to rest and reflect and see and engage in soul searching and so forth. And God himself really did take time to rest. I'm not saying God gets tired. I'm not really going to make that theological error, but I think that's a kind of it shows how important it is to take a Sabbath. And there's nothing wrong. And I lived in Europe when I did my PhD. I think one of the differences that we see between the US and Europe is people in Europe take rest and vacation all the time. I wondered sometimes, when are they getting things done? Every time I run into my friends, I went to France, I went to Belgium, and blah, blah, blah. Well, in America, you have 2 weeks and that's it. Okay, then Europeans are as efficient as Americans are. I mean, it's just, they just enjoy life and they take, ample time to rest and, enjoy. And I think I'm not going to change Americans' mindset, but I think it's deeply important, and we shouldn't live for productivity. Like, it shouldn't be our idol. And I think also we shouldn't be lazy, of course. I mean, but we have to keep the balance. That's it.
Oh, thank you for such a good reminder. And thank you, Praveen, Mihretu, and Regina, for your thoughtful responses. And audience, thank you so much for your questions. I know we didn't get to all of them. We will try to follow up. And if you would like your question to be answered and addressed, please leave us your email in the chat box and we'll follow up with you. Now, as all good things do come to an end, we're going to have to close our event tonight. So I'm going to ask each speaker to give a very brief concluding comment. Let's start with Praveen.
Thank you, Louise, and thanks again for the chance to have this event and this conversation. A lot of fun, very stimulating and enjoyable. My brief thought to leave you with is to reiterate what I had said in my talk, which is that I believe we're meant to wonder. I believe that we're meant to be in awe. And I really think that that is an important aspect of what it means to be made in his image, to explore the depths of what he has made and how that reflects his goodness, and to make it known, and to represent that and to reflect that where we go. And not each of us across this world have an equal opportunity to do that. The inequality across this world is so unfathomably large. I feel very extraordinarily fortunate and lucky and privileged and almost in a luxurious position to sit here and say that, we should be wondering and be in awe when many in this world are just trying to survive. And so when we talk about how human dignity is being stripped and ripped from many people, it's not simply that they don't have the food and the basics for life. Obviously, that is enough for the conversation. But it's even more than that, because I believe they've been made just like me and you and everybody here to have the privilege and the opportunity to wonder, to be in awe, to experience beauty. And the inability to do so in the circumstances that they're in is further stripping of their dignity as humans. And so I ask that we all think about that and wrestle with that and take the responsibility to fulfill that calling with pleasure and with a sense of somberness as well.
I would like to say that science and faith are not enemies, they are allies. And I think we can get a fuller picture about the world around us, about ourselves, when we bring these two important domains of human inquiry together. one informs the other. So therefore, this unfounded fear that somehow faith disinfects, somehow damages the quality of scientific research is completely without any evidential base. So therefore, as the keynote speaker convinced us tonight, I think we need to walk away that God has created such a wonderful, complicated world. As the book of Ecclesiastes say, he has put eternity in human heart. So therefore, we have to realize that we are finite beings. We will never be able to get to the bottom of things. In any discipline, physics, biology, and other disciplines, there are tons of things that we don't know. So therefore, we have to enjoy the process, enjoy the opportunities that God has given us. And the generation yet to come after us is going to explore even more. And we do our best to some extent, and then we leave the rest to the generations to come. So therefore, we should dispel, if we have any fear, that science and faith are somehow, they don't really go together. In fact, without faith, scientific progress cannot move forward. And thank you.
Yes, just want to leave us with this idea of what being human is in praxis, right? Like being human means extending welcome to others, just as Praveen had talked about earlier, some of the somber realities of our world. Being human means we extend that welcome to people, especially those who are most unfamiliar. Our humanity grows, strengthens, and thrives in the company of these different others whom God has stamped his image upon. But the DNA that in one cell gets stretched out over 6 feet, and we all share that reality. Look for and see his divine image in those who do not look like you, eat the same food you do, speak the same language you're used to. It is in those interactions that we are the most human in our humanity. Our minds expand, our bodies register belonging, and our souls take a little taste of what's really reality in heaven, where every tribe and tongue will confess that he is Lord. Thanks.
Thank you so much again, Praveen, Mihretu, and Regina. We have learned a great deal from you tonight and from each other. And this event would not be possible without the support of the APU Office of the Provost, College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Now, along similar lines of our discussion today, we would like to invite you to the upcoming American Scientific Affiliation 76th National Meeting in San Diego this July with the theme, What is a Human? Flourishing as a Person. The call for abstracts has begun, and the conference registration will start soon. Another sneak peek is our upcoming Transhumanism Symposium in summer 2023, in which we will explore the interface of genetic technologies, artificial intelligence, and faith. Stay tuned for more information. You can follow us on our website for future and archived events, including the recorded event tonight. You can also subscribe to the CRIS e-news through this email. Thank you so very much, everyone, for joining us today. Regardless of foreseeable and unforeseeable constraints, may we continue to uphold each other during a time such as this. May our empathy, compassion, and love increase. Take good care and have a blessed evening.